But I thought it might be interesting just to talk about the travels of gender for a brief moment. And I think I say this in the piece, when gender trouble was first proposed to be translated into French, the publisher Fayard said it was an inassimilable, which is of course the word used for unwanted migrants. And there were other people who thought, no, let's keep femininity in relationship to gender, or let's keep la différence sexuelle in relationship to gender, or, you know, different ways of handling that. And of course also queer studies has had a harder time taking hold in that particular place, and a hard time in Germany, and a very hard time in many other places. But it's a term that disrupts some of the more disciplinary or institutional ways we have of organizing knowledge, and suggests that we can't just take sexuality as a simple problem of identity, but as something that comes in diverse forms and interrupts various forms of life that may not seem to pertain to sexuality on the face of it. You know, I think that disruptive effect is felt, and sometimes it's resisted, but it's an important kind of development, and it's also one that kind of raises the question of what's the relationship between an academic field and even a discipline and a broader social movement, or a broader set of social movements. How do they inform each other? How do they resonate with one another? In my view, it's not the task of the academic to prescribe what a social movement should do. That's a form of kind of intellectual elitism, or at worst, social engineering that I don't really approve of. But I do think it's important for academics to move in and out of their more closed institutional spaces in order to find out what's happening, and to allow what's happening to register in academic language and institution making and unmaking. So there is a kind of obligation to move among registers, and to be someone who is not one place or another exclusively, but who takes on the task of translation, because that's sometimes precisely what has to happen. In the gay marriage debates, and I'm sorry to use France as my reference right now, there are other places I could use, and but it's been in the news, as you know, especially recently because of the gay marriage legislation that has passed, and some of the violent demonstrations that ensued. And what I wanted to say there is that there were many people, like in Lille, for instance, there was a demonstration contre genre, against gender. And I was trying to think, what does it mean to be against gender? What does it even mean to be for gender? You know, is it a kind of, you know, football team? You know, is it, I don't know, is it a flag that one waves? I mean, I didn't really understand contre genre. And it seems to me that what they were saying is that the term gender has allowed for people to think about the cultural variability of how people are embodied. In other words, they can become trans, they can shift their morphology, they can transition from female to male, or from female to trans, or they can transition out of those categories into some other space that they may name in a different way. And so part of it was to say, we've gone too far, there's too much freedom and access and variability, and what we need to do is bring all that back to biological male and biological female reference, and to build social institutions on the basis of those clear, binary, mutually exclusive reference. But being contre genre also meant, or means apparently, to be against things like gay marriage, or adoption for people who are outside of heterosexual marriage, and that includes, you know, all kinds of people. So if we think about that, well, what is parenting, or the rights to parent, or even like being a good parent, what does that have to do with what kind of sexual arrangement you're in? It seems to me that when people gathered to be against gender, they were also gathering to be against gay marriage and gay adoption, or the access to reproductive technology for people who are outside of established heterosexual marriages. And that means that gender then signifies something like new organizations of kinship. It signifies something like the separation between marital status and parenting rights, something that in many states and in several countries is already established in law. And some established set of established causal sequence is interrupted. Finally, I just wanted to say that gender's not a universal, you know. I work on it a lot, I have worked on it a lot. It's a term that's really crucial to my own thinking, but probably because I came through a certain language and read sociology and anthropology of a certain time and was working with that lexicon. But as I've traveled, or as I've confronted the way in which my own work or other work in feminist and queer theory has been translated in different countries, I find that it comes up against real impasses. And not because everybody is committed to biological sex understood in a certain way, but because the term gender is sometimes not even a term. Sometimes it only comes about as the inflection of a verb. It doesn't have a substantial place in a language other than the inflection of I refer to you, or I refer to something else, or I refer to myself. Then in those modes of reference, gender emerges, but it's not a thing. And it can't be understood as an object or a substance that can be analyzed separately from the relationships in which it's lived. And if there's something kind of more or less general that I could say about gender, I would want to say that it is relational, and that it works in language, and it works in institutions in ways that are sometimes quite explicit and sometimes quite implicit. But one gets treated a certain way, or one speaks a certain way, or one is spoken to a certain way, and it emerges in the context of those kinds of interactions. So it seems to me that gender studies can't market itself to every culture and every instance. It has to figure out what the problem of translation is, and actually sometimes let its vocabulary go in the name of understanding better how these kinds of issues are approached in different ways and in different languages. And so it's not an ideology that needs to market itself as such. It's a particular vocabulary that emerges from several times and spaces, and it comes up against certain kinds of blocks, and that's terribly important to allow that to happen and to learn from that and to revise our understanding of how language and power works accordingly.